From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
What are they over there doing?
He was like, when I heard
Shot my daddy for being black.
him, and he just,
You little
he just
shot my daddy for being black. And look, and they just standing because they right. He disabled. How the he gonna shoot y'all? He didn't got no gun.
Today, we look at the police killings of two black men, one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the other in Charlotte, North Carolina, where last night hundreds took to the streets and blocked Interstate 85 to protest the police shooting of 43-year-old African-American Keith Lamont Scott. We'll get response. Then President Obama addresses the global migrant crisis in his final speech to the United Nations as part of the first-ever summit for refugees and migrants.
I called this summit because this crisis is one of the most urgent tests of our time, our capacity for collective action. It tests, first and foremost, our ability to end conflicts, because so many of the world's refugees come from just 3 countries ravaged by war: Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia.
We'll get an update on the refugee crisis from Mohammed Badran, co-founder of Syrian Volunteers in the Netherlands, and Manfred Lindenbaum, a Holocaust survivor, advocate for refugees. We'll also speak with Oxfam President Raymond Offenheiser. Then the U.S. objected to language in the original draft of the Refugee Summit's resolution that said children should never be detained. We'll get response from a teenager held for more than a year at the Berks County Residential Center, an immigrant family jail in Pennsylvania.
The truth for all of us here, the children who are here and the mothers, this is a horrible experience to be in detention. Because more than a year of incarceration for a child is not just, without having committed any crime.
We'll speak with a physician just back from visiting detainees at Berks and with a former unaccompanied minor who fled Honduras at the age of 15. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Charlotte, North Carolina was rocked by protests overnight after hundreds took to the streets and blocked Interstate 85 to protest the fatal police shooting of 43-year-old African-American Keith Lamont Scott Tuesday. Video footage shows protesters blocking the highway where fires were lit. Police in riot gear responded by throwing tear gas at the crowds. Police say about a dozen officers were hurt during the conflict. Protesters were also injured. Keith Lamont Scott was shot and killed around 4 p.m. after police arrived to serve an arrest warrant for another person at Scott's housing complex. The accounts of the shooting diverge sharply. While the police claim they first tased and then shot Scott because he was armed and, quote, posed an imminent deadly threat, unquote, Scott's family says he was not armed, except with a book in hand. They said he'd been sitting in his car waiting to pick up his son after school. This is Scott's daughter speaking in a Facebook Live video recorded at the scene of the shooting.
What are they over there doing?
he was like, when I heard
Shot my daddy for being black.
him, and he just,
You little
he just
shot my daddy for being black. And look, and they just standing because they right. He disabled. How the he gonna shoot y'all? He didn't got no gun.
The officer who shot Scott was also black. Police have identified him as Brentley Vinson, who has been placed on administrative leave. 3 years ago, police in Charlotte shot and killed Jonathan Farrell, an unarmed African-American college student who was seeking help after a car crash in 2013. Officer Randall Carrick fired 12 bullets at Farrell. Officer Carrick was tried and acquitted of voluntary manslaughter last year. This comes as protests also erupted in Tulsa, Oklahoma, over the fatal police shooting of 40-year-old African-American Terrence Crutcher, who was shot by a white police officer, Betty Shelby, while his hands were in the air. Hundreds gathered Tuesday outside the Tulsa Police Department demanding her firing. Crutcher was shot and killed around 8 p.m. Friday after his car broke down. Some of the video, released Monday, comes from police helicopter footage in which you can hear the man in the helicopter saying about Crutcher, "That looks like a bad dude." Footage from police dash cam video shows Crutcher walking away from officers with his hands in the air, then slowly putting his hands on the side of his own car as he's surrounded by officers. The video captures a voice coming over the police radio saying he's just been tasered, and then a woman's voice yelling "shots fired" as the video shows Crutcher's arms falling to the pavement. We'll have more on both of these shootings with Bree Newsom of North Carolina and Vince Warren of the Center for Constitutional Rights. In news from the war in Syria, Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov are meeting in New York today to discuss the collapse of the ceasefire agreement and the attack on UN aid convoys Monday. This comes as the United States is saying Russia's likely responsible for Monday's attack, which destroyed 18 of the convoys as aid workers were unloading food and other supplies at a Red Crescent warehouse. The Red Cross says 20 people were killed. Russia has denied responsibility. In updates to this weekend's bombings in New York and New Jersey, suspect Ahmad Khan Rahami has been charged in a Manhattan federal court with bombing, property destruction, and the use of weapons of mass destruction. He was not charged with any terrorism-related crimes. Rahami is the main suspect in the bombings. Police say they identified him from surveillance video, which showed him at both sites in Manhattan where bombs were planted. On 23rd Street, where the bomb did explode, injuring 29 people, and 4 blocks away on 27th Street, where a bomb did not explode. Authorities also say his fingerprints were found on that device on 27th Street. He was arrested after a shootout in Linden, New Jersey Monday. And officers were both injured, and he also faces multiple counts of attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. The charges filed Tuesday in Manhattan courtroom suggest prosecutors have not been able to tie Rahami to any non-state terrorist organizations. This comes as information continues to emerge about Rahami. His father says Rahami was arrested in 2014 for allegedly stabbing a family member. He was not indicted on the charges. His father says at the time he called the FBI and referred to his son as a terrorist, prompting the FBI to open an investigation which found no evidence to support his father's statement. In news from the campaign trail, a new Washington Post investigation reveals Donald Trump used $258,000 from his family foundation, the Donald J. Trump Foundation, to pay off legal fees associated with his businesses, which is illegal under U.S. law. The disputes included $120,000 in unpaid fines over the height of a flagpole in Palm Beach, Florida, and a dispute over a Trump golf course in New York. In both cases, Trump reached settlements that involved him paying out foundation money to other charities. But this money should have been paid by his for-profit businesses, not the foundation. A previous Washington Post investigation showed Donald Trump has not donated any of his own money to his foundation since 2008. Meanwhile, the new Washington Post investigation also reveals Trump used foundation money to buy advertisements for his hotels and to buy a $10,000 portrait of himself. This is now the second documented case of Trump using his own foundation's money to buy portraits of himself. The other one was a 6-foot-tall portrait and cost $20,000. Meanwhile, Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., continues to spark controversy with his comments that compared Syrian refugees to poisoned Skittles. On Monday, he tweeted a graphic reading, quote, "If I had a bowl of Skittles and I told you just 3 would kill you, would you take a handful? That's our Syrian refugee problem." Well, now the man who shot the photo of the Skittles in the graphic has come forward, revealing he himself is a former refugee. David Kittos lives in Britain. He said, quote, "In 1974, when I was 6 years old, I was a refugee from the Turkish occupation of Cyprus, so I would never approve the use of this image against refugees," unquote. The parent company of Skittles has also pushed back against the tweet, saying, quote, "Skittles are candy, refugees are people. We don't feel it's an appropriate analogy," unquote. In financial news, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren grilled Wells Fargo CEO John Stumpf during his 2-hour testimony to the Senate Banking Committee Tuesday over the growing scandal at the major Wall Street bank involving thousands of employees who took private customer information to create 2 million fake accounts in order to meet sales targets. The scandal dates back to at least 2011, and CEO John Stumpf admits he's known about the practice since 2013. Wells Fargo has been fined $185 million. On Tuesday, Senator Elizabeth Warren called on Stumpf to be investigated and to resign.
But you squeezed your employees to the breaking point so they would cheat customers and you could drive up the value of your stock and put hundreds of millions of dollars in your own pocket. And when it all blew up, you kept your job, you kept your multi-million-dollar bonuses, and you went on television to blame thousands of $12 an hour employees who were just trying to meet cross-sell quotas that made you rich. This is about accountability. You should resign. You should give back the money that you took while this scam was going on, and you should be criminally investigated by both the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Here in New York, the United Nations General Assembly held its first-ever summit for refugees and migrants. The summit produced a non-binding declaration detailing a more coordinated and humane response to the biggest migration upheaval since World War II. President Obama also announced the United States will resettle 110,000 refugees from around the world, a nearly 60% increase from 2015, but still only a tiny fraction of the number of refugees resettled in other countries. Only hours after the meeting was occurring in New York, a massive fire swept through a refugee camp on the Greek island of Lesbos. The fire at the Moria camp destroyed dozens of homes and tents and forced thousands of people to flee. We'll have more on the Summit for Refugees and Migrants later in the broadcast. In Brussels, Belgium, as many as 15,000 people marched Tuesday to demand the European Union abandon 2 controversial trade deals, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between EU and the U.S., and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada. This is one of the protesters.
The aim of the treaty is to remove all barriers, non-related to tariffs, to allow, they say, more competitivity, free trade, free market. But the problem is that those barriers also include food controls, food security, safety of the food chain, and that is not something we can tolerate as citizens, as human beings, fathers.
The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, known as TTIP, would be the largest trade deal in the world. It's faced resistance both in the United States and across Europe. In a landmark ruling, a federal judge in Pennsylvania has ordered the immediate release of a prisoner from long-term solitary confinement. Arthur Chetuwayo Johnson has not touched another human being, other than a guard, since 1979. He's challenging his conditions as cruel and unusual. He described his isolation in a statement for the court, quote, "During my 36 years in solitary confinement, my cell has been about 7 feet by 12 feet, smaller than many cages used to hold animals at zoos. My cell has been lighted 24 hours per day with no break during day or night. I have been allowed at most 1 hour of time outside 5 days a week in a fenced-in exercise cage that's slightly larger than my cell. I've been forced to eat all of my meals alone in my cell. Each time I leave my cell, I'm forced to undergo a mandatory strip search. I have not been accused of any serious disciplinary infraction in more than 25 years, he wrote. On Tuesday, Judge Christopher Connor called for a plan within a week to reintegrate Johnson into the general population in 90 days. Johnson was convicted of homicide and sentenced to life without parole at age 18. He is now 64 years old. While behind bars, he became politicized through the Black Liberation Movement. His case is handled by the Abolitionist Law Center and Jones Day Law Firm. And in news from the ongoing movement to stop the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe Chairman Dave Archambault has called on the United Nations Human Rights Council to oppose the project, saying the United States has failed to honor the tribe's sovereign rights and treaty land.
Well, we have gone To the court in the United States, our courts have failed to protect our sovereign rights, our sacred places, and our water. We call upon the Human Rights Council and all member states to condemn the destruction of our sacred places and to support our nation's efforts to ensure that our sovereign rights are respected. We ask that you call upon all parties to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline and to protect the environment, our nation's future, our culture, and our way of life.
That's Dave Archambault, the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, speaking in Geneva at the United Nations Human Rights Council on Tuesday. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show looking at police killings of two African-American men, one in Tulsa and one in Charlotte. In North Carolina, which was rocked by protests overnight after hundreds took to the street and blocked Interstate 85 to protest the police shooting of 43-year-old African-American Lamont Scott. Video shows protesters blocking the highway where fires were lit. Police are in riot gear, responded by throwing tear gas at the crowds. Police say about a dozen officers were hurt during the conflict. Protesters were also hurt.
Keith Lamont Scott was shot and killed around 4 p.m. Tuesday after police arrived to serve an arrest warrant for another person at Scott's housing complex. The accounts of the shooting diverged sharply. While the police claim they first tased and then shot Scott because he was armed and posed an imminent deadly threat, Scott's family says he was not armed except with a book. They say he'd been sitting in his car waiting to pick up his son after school. This is Scott's daughter speaking in a Facebook Live video recorded at the scene of the shooting.
What are they over there doing?
He was like, when I heard
Shot my daddy for being black.
him, and he just,
You little
he just
shot my daddy for being black. And look, and they just standing because they right. He disabled. How the he gonna shoot y'all? He didn't got no gun.
This comes as police in Tulsa, Oklahoma, have released a video showing a white police officer shooting and killing an unarmed 40-year-old African-American Terrence Crutcher while his hands were in the air. Officer Betty Shelby shot Crutcher around 8 p.m. on Friday after his car broke down. Some of the video released Monday came from a police helicopter footage in which one can hear the man in the helicopter saying about Crutcher, quote, "That looks like a bad dude." This is a clip from the police footage.
This guy's still walking and following commands.
Not for taser, I think.
Got a feeling that's about to happen.
That looks like a bad dude, too. To be honest, something.
Which way are they facing? Police 1, they're facing westbound. I think he may have just been tasered.
Shots fired!
Ooh.
321, we have shots fired. We have one suspect down. We need MC here.
They need to get this eastbound closed down if they could, because they're not going to be able to let anybody.
Okay.
Other footage from a police dash cam vehicle shows Crutcher walking slowly away from officers with his hands in the air, then putting his hands on the side of his own car as he's surrounded by officers. The video captures a voice coming over the police radio saying he's just been tasered, and then a woman's voice yelling shots fired as the video shows Crutcher's arms falling to the pavement. The Justice Department says it's investigating the shooting of Terrence Crutcher as a possible civil rights violation. On Tuesday, hundreds gathered outside the Tulsa Police Department to demand the firing of Officer Betty Shelby. For more, we're joined here in New York by Vince Warren, Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. On the phone with us, Bree Newsom, artist and activist. Last year, armed only with a helmet and climbing gear, she scaled the 30-foot flagpole on the South Carolina state capitol grounds and unhooked the Confederate flag. As police officers shouted at her to come down, Bree shimmied to the top of the flagpole, took the flag in her hand, and said, quote, "You come against me with hatred. I come against you in the name of God. This flag comes down today." She is joining us. She is from Charlotte, North Carolina, and via Democracy Now! Video stream in Washington, D.C., Rashad Robinson, Executive Director of Color of Change, who's launched a new petition called Terrence Crutcher Died for Being Black, Indict Officer Betty Shelby. So we welcome you all to Democracy Now! Bree, I want to begin with you. These riots that broke, you could call them uprisings, riots of fear and anger, protests in Charlotte, North Carolina that took place after the killing, the police killing. Can you talk about what you understand? You're not there now, but what you understood took place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what took place in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I am in contact with folks who are on the ground there, who were there, is what we have witnessed several times in the past 2 years, what we've witnessed in America since the 60s at least. And this is an incident of police brutality that in many ways is the straw breaking the camel's back kind of moment. Like many cities around the nation, in Charlotte, we have a real issue of wealth inequality. We've had several incidents of police brutality. One of the most notable cases was the case of Jonathan Farrell. This was a young man who was gunned down by police. He was also unarmed, had crashed his car and was looking for help, knocked on the door. The police showed up and killed him. There was an acquittal in that case. So like so many other cases, this moment that happened last night, this was not an isolated incident. This is a tipping point, a kind of boiling over moment for the city and for the nation in a lot of ways. Folks are not just reacting to what happened in Charlotte, but also to what happened in Tulsa and what happened in Baton Rouge.
And Vince Warren, the issue of, especially in Tulsa, a couple of things are quite different about this. One, we got the identity of the officer right away, and also the video surfaced pretty quickly, as opposed to in other instances, there's been battles over even getting the videos that the police have available to the public.
Yeah, a couple of things on that. That was significant, and I think it's really important. Let's be clear that the police departments don't do this out of the kindness of their hearts. They do it because of political pressure. So it's exactly these types of protests that we're seeing today. It's the independent journalists that are fighting for these things, make it politically hard for police departments not to put those things forward. I'd also want to point out that the Tulsa situation highlights a central problem with policing of black communities in particular, which is that they're trained to see non-compliance as escalation. So they ask you to do something. If you don't do it, then the police departments increase the use of force. Then, of course, they have to try to justify that use of force afterwards. The good thing about having these video situations is that all of us can see for ourselves what really happened. So I'm at this point now with the 193rd killing of a black man this year, where I am not inclined.
The number again?
193, according to the Guardian count. You know, the different people have different counts. It's amazing to me that nobody in America can tell me specifically how many black people have been killed by police officers. But after 193, I'm quite prepared not to believe the police department narratives about anything that happened. And these investigations and eyewitness reports become much more important.
Rashad Robinson, what do you understand about what took place in Tulsa? I mean, the protests that have been taking place there, coming out. On Monday, the video being released by the police, this helicopter footage, which is truly remarkable, showing Terrence Crutcher with his hands in the air, walking very slowly. His car had broken down to his car and then putting his hands on the car. The windows were up on this car.
Yeah, what we understand is just how much black people are not seen with humanity. You know, Vincent was absolutely right. This video was not released out of the goodness of the hearts of the local police department in Tulsa. It was released because they knew they had to start figuring out how to get ahead of this story, because the video is simply that bad. And in situations like this, over and over again, we watch as police departments concoct stories. And now we're seeing, stories about drugs, stories which they would have not known that, he had drugs in the car if he in fact did. All these reasons that try to legitimize the fact that the police were unable to sort of de-escalate and solve the situation, unable to figure out a story that makes it okay that a gun was pulled out and a man was shot dead. And police officers stood around for a while as this man laid on the ground and did not even try to get him medical help. This speaks to the ongoing way that from the start, Black people are never given the benefit of the doubt, are not seen as human, are seen as enemy combatants, and even in their death are seen as deserving, not deserving of medical support and deserving of the situations. This officer needs to be fired because we continue to come to these conversations where people want communities to come together. They want unity, they want conversations, and we don't get sort of the results that actually send a message to police officers that they'll be held accountable. But we also need to have a larger conversation because this is not about one bad apple or two bad apples. This is about systemic problems in police departments around the country, incentive structures that make it okay and incentivize the killing of Black people over and over and over again, and no one is held accountable.
I think this is a very telling comment from a protester, extremely angry last night in Charlotte, North Carolina.
A terrorist, New Jersey, New York, he was taken alive. They said they wanted to question him. So because of you wanting to question him, does his life mean more than our Black men across the nation?
So there you have a SOT from CNN, Vince Warren, where she says, you're telling me that you do not kill a man who is being referred to as a terrorist in New York. You can take him alive because you want him for questioning. But an African-American man, you shoot dead.
Absolutely. That is the precise question that I think Rashad and Bree and I are talking about. That Black lives are so dehumanized that it is okay structurally, it is okay within the context of the police department, it's okay in the context of the criminal justice system to kill Black people. And, you know, the reason why I think the Color of Change petition is so important is that a police officer is the only job in America where you can kill somebody and then you get desk duty. Desk duty almost becomes the default mechanism. If you asked anybody what's going to happen with these cases, people don't believe that this police officer, either of these police officers, are going to face serious charges, or they're going to get indicted, or they're going to get convicted, or they're going to get sentenced. People don't believe it. We've lost complete faith in the system because the system is designed to do the exact opposite of what Black people need.
And Rashad Robinson, what about the issue of now the Justice Department jumping in right away saying they're going to do an investigation? We've seen this happen time after many of these shootings, and what inevitably happens is the Justice Department almost always decides there's no criminal offense that even on the civil rights violations they can prosecute.
Well, this is part of the structural change that we need. The Justice Department actually doesn't have a real budget for these type of investigations, and this is part of the problem. And currently, the standard is so high for the Justice Department to bring charges that over and over in these situations, they may actually find problems and situations in which police departments or individual police acted inappropriately, and they can't bring charges because it meet this standard that is sort of so high and so hard to get over that, in fact, it really makes these situations okay over and over again. And so part of the long-term systemic work that we have to do, and we've been working on that, some of those campaigns are on colorofchange.org as well, is one that we have to start tying the federal dollars that go into local law departments, local police departments, to their performance, and stop giving huge sums of money to police departments that don't meet basic standards and don't value Black lives. If our federal government can defund local schools for not meeting standards, but still give huge block grants to local police departments that do not value our lives, then we are not dealing with the incentive structures and not sort of shifting the power dynamic and forcing real change. And if we don't deal with the fact that the standards are so high that we can never hold anyone accountable, then we will be in this situation 5, 10, 15 years from now. We will have people calling for unity, asking Black people to stand down and be peaceful and not be upset, to tell people to give police officers the benefit of the doubt when Black people never get the benefit of the doubt. We need systemic change.
I wanted to ask Bree Newsom, to remind people, when you climbed that flagpole on the grounds of the Columbia State House in South Carolina and said this flag comes down today, the Confederate flag, it was in response response to the killing of the beautiful 9, the 9 people at the Emmanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and their pastor, Clemente Pinckney, by a white supremacist who wrapped himself in the Confederate flag. In this case, Bree, you have Keith Lamont Scott in Charlotte, North Carolina, killed by an African-American officer, Brentley Vinson. And in the case of Tulsa, you have a white woman police officer, Betty Shelby, who killed Terrence Crutcher. Your response?
Yes, I think sometimes there's this hyper-focus on, well, what is the race of the police officer? That's not the issue. Everyone can participate in white supremacy and white supremacist systems. And we have to recognize that the policing system in America is rooted in slavery and slave patrols. I would argue that slavery never ended because in the 13th Amendment it is codified that slavery is legal in cases of criminal punishment. And when we look at history, we see that as soon as emancipation happened, there was the institution of the Black Codes. And I believe that is the root of mass incarceration and police brutality as it exists today. I also want to remind everyone that what happened in Charleston last year was also within the context of police brutality as well. You know, Clemente Pinckney had just succeeded in getting body camera legislation passed in North Charleston in response to the Walter Scott case. So police brutality has always been woven throughout the story of civil rights and the struggle for equality in America. It's always been there. This issue is as old as policing in America. And, of course, Walter Scott was the man who was stopped for a taillight being out, a traffic stop, and a police officer blew him away as he ran through a park. It was only caught because a bystander flipped open his cell phone and started to film. We're going to leave it there, but, of course, we're going to continue to cover all of this. Bree Newsome, thanks so much for joining us, artist and activist from Charlotte, North Carolina. Vince Warren is the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and Rashad Robinson is executive director of Color of Change, has launched a petition that is titled Terrence Crutcher Died for Being Black, Indict Officer Betty Shelby. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at the massive global refugee crisis. Stay with us.
Traces we don't understand. Open your mind. We won't give in. Adam بديت رحلتنا بقهار بموت صغير بليل بارد وبحر مظلم موفن جمعت كل ذكرياتي وفيها آلامي وأحلامي لا مجال للترجع فوطني مدمر Restless minds go astray. We all need a place to stay. Some will hope, some will pray somewhere, someday. Different space, different ground, different words, different sound. This is what you will find somewhere. Roads won't end. Traces we don't understand. Open your mind.
Moving by Refugees Welcome here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Mimi Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the meeting of 193 member states of the United Nations for the first ever summit for refugees and migrants in New York City. The summit produced a non-binding declaration detailing a more coordinated and humane response to the biggest migration upheaval since World War II. President Obama used his 8th and final address to the UN General Assembly as president to announce a pledge by 50 countries to admit 360,000 refugees from conflict-ridden areas this year. He said world leaders have vowed to double the number from last year.
A record 65 million people have been displaced by conflicts around the world. This is the first time the number of migrants has topped 60 million. Most have fled to areas within their own countries, largely in Syria and Iraq. But about 21 million refugees have been forced to leave their countries due to conflict or persecution. 9 million people have been displaced by the 6-year conflict in Syria alone, while more than 4 million others have fled Syria. Despite the focus on the influx of refugees in European countries, 86% of the world's refugees are hosted in developing regions close to conflict zones like Turkey, Jordan, Ethiopia. Speaking Tuesday, President Obama urged wealthy countries to do more to help resolve the global refugee problem.
We have to imagine what it would be like for our family, for our children, if the unspeakable happened to us. And we should all understand that ultimately our world will be more secure if we are prepared to help those in need and the nations who are carrying the largest burden with respect to accommodating these refugees.
President Obama also announced the United States will resettle 110,000 refugees from around the world, a nearly 60% increase from 2015.
For more, we're joined by 3 guests. In Washington, D.C., Mohammed Badran is with us, co-founder of Syrian Volunteers in the Netherlands. On Monday, he spoke at the UN Summit on Refugees and Migrants. Here in New York, Manfred Lindenbaum is with us, Holocaust survivor, advocate for refugees. In 1939, Manfred and his brother fled from Germany to Poland and then to England on the famous Kindertransport, just days before the Nazis invaded. In 1946, the Jewish refugee organization HIAS reunited Manfred with an aunt and uncle living in New Jersey. He's been in the U.S. ever since. Also with us is Raymond Offenheiser, president of the International Humanitarian and Development Organization, Oxfam America. The organization is participating in this year's United Nations General Assembly. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's start with Ray Offenheiser. Talk about what has to be done right now. I mean, we are seeing the largest influx of refugees since World War II.
Right. I mean, it's an unprecedented moment, and I think the urgency was felt by the international community to have this summit. And as you said, basically the focus was this declaration for refugees and migrants that was basically put together this summer and negotiated this summer, and it was brought to the UN General Assembly for approval. At the heart of the problem really is this disproportionate responsibility that's being felt by the neighboring countries that in the way that you mentioned. And the idea of having this summit was in some sense to get commitments about burden sharing. Unfortunately, what we found at the end of the day was somewhat of a minimalist approach to the way governments were actually negotiating the final outcome. And so we didn't get the kinds of burden-sharing commitments that we'd hoped for, but rather we got a reaffirmation of commitments to basic principles on the Convention of Refugees from 1951 and the Protocol of 1967, but we didn't get bold commitments for the kind of burden sharing across both, the hosting and non-hosting countries that we hope would be at the heart of this agreement.
And could you be more specific about this burden sharing? Because clearly we're getting all the attention to what is happening to the refugees coming into Europe, and we're seeing in the presidential debate the battle over how we're going to deal with people coming into the United States. But what are the countries and what are the problems faced by the developing countries near the conflict zones?
Well, I mean, I think as you've reported in the past, I mean, we're seeing a country like Lebanon with, literally 1 million plus refugees in a country of 4 million. We are seeing, comparable numbers, 1.5 million or so in Jordan, a country of 6 million. I mean, imagine that in the state of Massachusetts, literally 1.5 million refugees in a state with 6 million population. How would you support that? These neighboring countries have been extraordinarily generous in providing basic education, basic health services, and so forth. The World Bank has actually tried to subsidize some of that, but we're at a point where these countries are at the breaking point, both socially, politically, and economically, in their ability to manage this. So the international community, in the face of this kind of migration and refugee crisis, has got to begin to develop new systems, new approaches, and a more robust way of dealing with this, and particularly the burden sharing across countries. I think one of the key statistics to remember is that the 5 or 6 wealthiest countries in the world only host 9% of this refugee population.
In Syria, the UN has suspended all aid after its aid convoys were attacked by warplanes outside Aleppo. Oxfam had 9,000 hygiene kits ready to be delivered to Aleppo, but all aid has now been halted.
That's correct, and the ceasefire is now over. So we're in a situation where all of that aid, some 31 trucks that were supposed to be getting in, did not get in, and there's little promise that they will. In our view, this was an outrageous act. I mean, everyone knew that that convoy was on that road. They've been waiting for days for a green light to get in, and then there was an attack, and there was actually a double hit. In other words, the convoy was hit twice on that road. And so literally the consequences, all of those people that would have been receiving that aid will not receive it. And there's a little clarity as to what, how we are going to return to a situation where we have enough of a ceasefire to get that aid in.
We're also joined by Mohammed Badran, who's a co-founder of Syrian Volunteers. What was the message that you gave to the summit, and could you talk about your own experience as a refugee?
Yes, absolutely. Well, our message was really clear at the summit. We showed the international community that they have to do more for refugees, and we showed them that being a refugee is more as an experience that you like for like a couple of times you will feel like you need help, but afterwards you kind of provide help. So not as always you stay in in a victim, and it's people they always look at you that you are they always underestimated you. So that was actually our message to the during the UN summit. And we also we focus on how the higher education is actually really almost impossible to get an access to European universities. So that's actually was our message.
I also want to bring in Manfred Lindenbaum. You bring certainly a long historical perspective to all of this. Can you explain how you as a child became a refugee?
Well, when I heard about this conference at the United Nations, my mind immediately went back to the Evian conference in France in 1938, at which the countries got together and in effect decided no matter what happens, we are not taking in any children refugees, we're taking in no refugees, led by the United States. One country after another said that. And 3 weeks later, 17,000 of us Jews in Germany were actually rounded up and taken to the border and chased across the border, actually physically chased across the border into Poland. And my fear was, is this going to be one of these conferences where everybody says nice things and in effect says it's going to continue as before? I didn't feel quite that pessimistic. I think that it's brought it back on the front page.
But explain what happened when you got to Poland. What was this Kindertransport?
Well, when I got to Poland, we actually, by the way, when we got to Poland, within 36 hours, there were two relief organizations which came. One was HIAS and one was the Joint Distribution Committee. And they brought us things like, and I think refugees today can relate to that, they brought us things like bags to put straw in so we didn't sleep on the ground. And,
how old were you?
I was 6. Some of the people slept in the stables. We got in the 4th story of a burnt-out building with no facilities in it. And we were there for 10 months.
And then what was the Kindertransport?
The Kindertransport was when the German army was on the border. The Kindertransport was over because the United States at that point said that we're not taking in any Jewish children, and they couldn't get the bill out of committee. England had decided under great pressure to take in 10,000. They were already there, and at the last minute, as the German army was coming over, they got a few hundred of us onto a Polish warship. And that was took me and my brother to England. And I wouldn't let my sister on. She was 14, so she was murdered with the rest of my family.
And Raymond Offenheiser, this issue of the children and the United States back then saying it would not take any more Jewish children, part of the problem in terms of coming together in agreement this year was that the United States was objecting to calls for no detention for children who are refugees and concerned about its policies towards Central American refugees on its southern border.
Yes, the United States actually objected to the final draft of the declaration in the middle of the summer and held up the final conclusion and vote for 2 days over this particular issue. And what they wanted to do was put in language that would allow the possibility of detention, particularly in reference to the Central American border cases where there is active detention going on. And this was a very specific move by the United States that really would require the entire process to stop and new language to be put in to allow for that.
And we're going to talk about that in our next segment. But I wanted to ask, our guest Manfred Lindenbaum about the comments of the Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's oldest son, Donald Trump Jr., who compared Syrian refugees to poisoned Skittles. He tweeted a graphic that said, if I had a bowl of Skittles and I told you just 3 would kill you, would you take a handful? That's our Syrian refugee problem. The company that makes Skittles then went on to tweet back saying, Skittles are candy, refugees are people. We don't feel it's an appropriate analogy. Your response when you heard Donald Trump Jr.?
I think it's absolutely horrible. It brings back the dark images of children being murdered. I can only feel horrible for him that he has such a twisted mentality that he's able to come out with that. He's a very poor individual. And
Mohammed Badran, he was talking about Syrian refugees. Your response?
Well, you know, firstly, like when I talk not only about Syrian refugees. I talk about all refugees, and I talk about how we also are contributing to the society where we are living, and how we want to eager to be part of the society. So I think this is a good response for what he said.
Mohammed, I'd like to ask you about your experiences, because you've been co-founding the Syrian Volunteers in the Netherlands. How has the Netherlands responded compared to other European countries to the refugee crisis?
Well, in the Netherlands, is quite you feel welcome. So there is at the moment actually really great initiatives coming from the citizens, coming from the Dutch locals. To help refugees with integration, but there's still sometimes challenges that you have to challenge in a new community and in new society. So, but we are working on this. So but I think the Netherlands, I feel really grateful to be in such a country.
Well, we want to thank you all for being with us. We've been speaking with Manfred Lindenbaum, who is a survivor of the Holocaust. He and his brother made it over on the Kinder transport from Poland to England. The U.S. would not take any more Jewish children. Raymond Offenheiser is the head of Oxfam America. And Mohammed Badran, speaking to us from Washington, a refugee from Damascus, Syria, organized Syrian volunteers in the Netherlands. They're all gathered here in New York for this refugee summit at the United Nations. On the issue of the U.S. changing the language of children in detention, we're going to talk about that next. Stay with us. Thank you so much.
غريبة الدنيا غريبة 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 يابا ديارنا صارت بعيدة 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 لك هجرتين
Songs of the Syrian refugees, music by 2 Syrian refugees located in Zaatari, Jordan. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we continue to look at the UN Summit for Refugees and Migrants, which produced a non-binding declaration on developing a coordinated and humane response to the migration crisis. The United States objected to language in the original draft of the resolution that said children should never be detained. The agreement ultimately said children should, quote, seldom, if ever, be detained, and calls it a, quote, measure of last resort. This comes as teenagers held at the Berks County Residential Center, an immigrant family jail in Pennsylvania, are protesting their indefinite detention. Some have been held more than a year while they seek asylum with their mothers, who are also detained. This is 16-year-old Stephanie Adriana Mendez from El Salvador responding to the United States' insistence on changing the language of the summit's declaration.
Antes habían dicho que la rechazaban totalmente y hoy están diciendo que es una medida alternativa.
They had said before they rejected it completely, but now they're saying it is an alternative measure. And I think it should not be that way. Because the truth for all of us here, the children who are here and the mothers, this is a horrible experience to be in detention. Because more than a year of incarceration for a child is not just, without having committed any crime.
Cometido ningún delito. La mayoría de los que estamos acá, casi todos, la verdad.
The majority of us who are here, almost all of us, really all of us, have family. We have family here to receive us. I have family in Maryland, in Los Angeles, and Florida. My father is in Texas waiting for us.
Mi papá está en Texas esperándonos. Tengo 16 años y soy del Salvador.
I am 16 years old. I am from El Salvador, and I entered the 20th of August in 2015. I arrived at Dilley, Texas, the 26th of August, and I was in that place for 2 months. There, my birthday passed. I turned 16. Then on the 28th of October, we arrived at Berks and have been here for 11 months in this place. In total, I have 393 days in detention, and soon it will be my birthday. Truthfully, I hope not to turn 17 here, again while incarcerated.
Mi cumpleaños y la verdad espero no pasar mis 17 años acá otra vez encarcelada.
That's 16-year-old Stephanie Adriana Mendez from El Salvador. For more, we're joined by 2 guests who participated in the Shadow Summit to discuss the U.S. response to the Central American refugees. Dr. Alan Keller is back with us, Associate Professor of Medicine at NYU School of Medicine, co-founder and director of the Bellevue NYU Program for Survivors of Torture and the New York University Center for Health and Human Rights. He's recognized internationally for his expertise in evaluating and caring for survivors of torture. We are also joined in this segment by Elvis Garcia. Elvis Garcia is a former unaccompanied minor who fled from Honduras to the United States when he was 15 years old. Dr. Alan Keller, let's go right to the U.S. change of the language of the resolution. Explain what happened.
Well, it just goes to show language matters. And if it were as simple as saying, as a matter of last resort, we detain children, that sounds palatable. But I must tell you, the children at Berks and the thousands of women and children who've been detained from Central America infer this is not a measure of last resort, but a measure of first, second, and third resort. And in addition to those teenagers that were mentioned, it's important to note that in this gulag of family detention centers that has sprung up around the country, there, over the course of the last year, have been thousands of infants. At Berks, for example, there are several children who celebrated their first and second birthdays there. So these are kids, in addition to the young adults you mentioned. And it can only be said that these children and young adults are being robbed of that most sacred thing, childhood. And what really scares me is that in the case of the Central Americans, it's without adequate protection.
And Elvis Garcia, what message did you bring? Talk about your own experience leaving your homeland, Honduras, when you were 15 years old.
My message is that the United States has to do more. Not only the U.S., but all the other countries that in the world, that they have to start working, they start to they have to start doing a little bit more for refugees and immigrants. My opinion on this is that they have to start treating what is happening in Central America as a humanitarian crisis. You see that all of these children, all of these families are living because of violence. And it is important for the U.S. to start treating this as a humanitarian crisis.
I wanted to ask Dr. Keller, how did the U.S. exactly lobby to change no kids should be in detention, which now is not just about the United States, it's about the whole world, to, well, only seldom? How do they actually do it behind the scenes?
Well, because the United States has power. And frankly, it's always been the case. In international politics, we play hardball. Now, I mean, this whole issue, though, speaks to a dichotomy or a disconnect with President Obama. I mean, his words about humanizing refugees, I think, are so compelling, so important, and I deeply believe he means them. On the other hand, somewhere along the line, in his head or his policy advisors, it clicked. Oh, these children and women are not refugees. So it all comes back to, there's a saying in science, garbage in, garbage out. So the underlying problem was from the very beginning, we didn't realize or perceive them as refugees. We perceived them as illegal immigrants, and the solution was enforcement. And when the solution is enforcement, the solution is detention. When it's a humanitarian crisis, there are other things. It also speaks to, and the president mentioned this as well, how we look at refugees has changed. We used to think of refugees as a group that was there for a few weeks, a month, maybe a year. We have refugee camps around the world that have basically been there for more than 20 years. And the Central Americans also demand us to broaden how we think about refugees, both in terms of how we treat them and how we address the root causes.
Well, I think probably President Obama's most quoted line from yesterday's address was that if you countries who build walls imprison themselves, right. And yet here we are. It is, in essence, his policy is imprisoning people once they get into the United States.
Well, that's why I remain, in spite of being deeply frustrated and saddened, I also remain deeply optimistic because I know the president means that. I know his advisors do. And with the stroke of a pen, he could end family detention. And so I look forward to holding that piece of paper for him to do so, because this is a matter not only of human rights, but of health.
With the stroke of a pen, I mean, instead of ending detention, he changed the language so that it wouldn't be a resolution anywhere in the world that children would not be detained. And for that, I wanted to get, Elvis, your comment. You came over when you were 15, your response to children detained.
I don't think there should be detention for anybody who's seeking protection. We understand that there are thousands of families fleeing Central America because of violence, and they come to the U.S. looking for protections. And I think that we should start welcoming immigrants and refugees to the U.S. We shouldn't be putting them in detention. Especially when they come looking for protection, we should provide that protection instead of putting them in detention facilities.
We have 10 seconds, Juan.
And just quickly, how this violence has arisen so quickly over the last 10, 15 years in Central America?
It has. When I came to the U.S., I came, even though there were a lot of violence where I was living, I came mainly for economic reasons. But that has changed now.
10 seconds.
Many of the children that are coming today to the U.S., they are coming because of gang violence, because violence in general. Many of them are being persecuted, and they come to the U.S. for those reasons.
I want to thank you both for being with us. A conversation, of course, we will continue to have. Elvis Garcia and Dr. Alan Keller. We will link to your letter published in the Washington Post today at DemocracyNow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.